Reformation is all but a new phenomenon. Calvin succinctly characterized human existence when he wrote, "Nous avons toujours un pied levé." We are always on our way. Calvin meant this in a theological way, but it is also true in a more literal sense. People have always been on their way, be it as pilgrims, as merchants, as adventurers, or worse, as crusaders. The early modern period witnessed a dramatic increase of forced migration. The early modern preoccupation with purgation went hand in hand with the expulsion of foreign elements. Jews and Moriscos were probably the first victims of this obsessive desire to keep the community pure. The Reformation and the ensuing outbursts of religious violence induced literally thousands of especially Protestants to seek their refuge elsewhere. Scholarship has long focused on reformed refugees, and they did indeed outnumber other refugees. Historians like Schilling and Alderman pictured them as the forebears of a radical and staunch reformed identity. More recently, historians have acknowledged how one-sided this picture is. Dutch reformed that went to Catholic Cologne in the 16th century fostered economic motives beside perhaps religious ones. Their aim was to ensure a better future, not just in a religious sense, but also in an economic sense. Moreover, Reformed were not the only ones that had to flee persecutions. Lutherans, Catholics, and above all the Anabaptists often shared the same faith. Reformed are my main topic, my main research area. That is why I confine myself to some remarks on how the Reformed ascribe meaning to this refugee experience. Well, you made it.
Yes. Fine.
The Reformed tradition recounted several waves of persecution. These persecutions were indeed provoked by an urgent desire to purge societies from heretical diseases and to re-establish medieval ecclesiastical unity. Early modern people used disputations, coercion, and physical violence to restore this unity, and disputations often preluded violence. Hence, I agree with those historians that state that religious toleration only became possible once people accepted religious diversity as a matter of fact. The 16th century persecutions induced the Reformed to identify themselves as a suffering church. Just like the Anabaptists, they pointed at the example of Christ to show that the true church had always been oppressed, had always been persecuted, and hence those who oppressed and persecuted could never be a true church. Refugees became part of a larger story on suffering. They were, however, far away from ascribing a special status to refugees or regarding them as the forebears of a staunch Reformed identity. Keeping Tertullian's warning in mind, they were even unsure whether a flight was permitted. Was a flight not a sign of cowardice? And should especially ministers not rather stay with their flock? It was John Calvin, however, who made a flight a reasonable option. If one lacked the courage to stand firm, a flight was far better than accommodation to the Catholic settings. The Reformed perspective, however, changed throughout the ages. In the early 17th century, Johannes Comenius described a flight as a heroic act of faith. Holses describing the suffering of the Bohemian refugees emphasized the similarities between Christ and the refugees. After all, Christ had been a refugee. Comenius hesitated whether refugees were to be counted among the martyrs. He thought that martyrdom required the death of the believer, of the confessor. The French Huguenots in the 17th century went beyond Comenius. According to Isaac Le Bon, the refugees were indeed the best and purest part of Christ's church. He pointed at the Old Testament examples such as Abraham, Elijah, and of course the example of Jesus fleeing to Egypt. Being a refugee became something to be proud of. Authors like Le Bon and Benoit created an ongoing story of Reformed suffering. According to them, this story of suffering had started with Old Testament heroes like Abraham, Moses, Elijah, continued with Jesus, Paul, the Christians under the Roman Empire, the Cathars, Wycliffe, Huss, etc., etc. Hence, they created an ongoing story of Reformed suffering, created a succession of Reformed martyrs. This succession of Reformed martyrs was indeed the Reformed counterpart of the Catholic apostolic succession. These two successions, of course, belong to the invented traditions, and they both served to prove one's own right and to support one's own truth claim. The Reformed Church was the true church, for the martyr succession proved that it rooted back to the Apostolic Church. Reformed became more and more inclined to identify themselves as a suffering church. This identification was to some extent highly artificial. In the Dutch Republic, for example, the Reformed possessed a safe majority position, but their solidarity and their identification with their French brothers and sisters allowed them to present themselves as a minority, and that's what they did. Meanwhile, this identification with the suffering church helped them to distance themselves from the Catholic Church. It helped to create a hostile picture of the Catholic Church, since this church, after all, behaved like the Pharisees, persecuting and killing true believers. Protestant writers started to juxtapose Protestant toleration versus Catholic tyranny, found them problematic to stay on. At the same time, this idea of a suffering church helped to create a strong solidarity with the refugees. Helping refugees became a matter of honor, since refugees shared the same fate as Christ and followed his footsteps. Believers were obliged to support them. Reformed writers were proud to announce that Reformed financial support for the Bohemian brethren exceeded the Lutheran support. The religious motives to support refugees merged with economic motives. Already during the 16th century, Reformed refugees referred to the contribution they made to welfare. This tendency became even stronger in the 17th century. Especially the French Huguenots were perceived as industrious laborers and successful merchants that were extremely well able to make a significant contribution to local economies. They were supposed to be the best part of the French nation, not only in a religious sense, but also in a cultural and economic sense. And hence, Brandenburg, Prussia, and the Dutch Republic, for example, were happy to grant these Huguenot privileges, such as tax exemptions, in order to seduce them to come to these countries. The British tried to seduce the Huguenots to come over to America in order to further their colonies overseas. The idea that refugees could very well contribute was by a mercantile vision, a growing population was regarded as a strong asset. In short, the readiness among Protestants to help refugees was not just a sign of Christian benevolence, but also a sign of well-understood self-interest. The history of the integration of refugees is nevertheless not a rosy one. Early modern guilds feared the competition of refugees and excluded them from their circles. Immigrants were often seen as an infringement of the normal order, and they were often perceived as strangers and vagabonds that threatened the local community. Hospitality to refugees was limited. Although Amsterdam granted the Huguenot tax exemptions, the French were obliged to support their own poor. Local deaconeries confined themselves to helping their own members. The same applied to 16th century Emden. The Dutch refugees were supposed to create their own deaconeries. It took a long time to integrate refugees into local societies. In the 17th century Frankfurt, the Dutch were still a group apart, and German ministers suggested that 1 century would do to learn proper German. French refugees in Amsterdam continued to speak French for 2 centuries. Legal records show that they needed an interpreter to communicate with the Dutch. The refusal to integrate themselves in the Dutch Republic didn't prevent the Dutch from appreciating the contributions men like Pierre Deel, Descartes, and so many others made to Dutch culture. In the end, refugees always succeeded in obtaining a place in their host societies and in making a contribution to these societies. Merkel's famous statement, "Wir haben schon vieles geschafft, wir schaffen das," might be highly contestable from a political point of view. From an historical point of view, it is entirely right. I stayed here 4 minutes, I think.
So good morning, and thank you for waiting some minutes for me. My train was delayed, unfortunately, but I'm here now. And what I would like to do in the following minutes is briefly introduce my doctoral research that I finished earlier this year, as well as introduce you into how historians have studied, especially Catholic refugee movements in the past years. To start with, I should note that politics and religion were inseparably linked in early modern Europe. As a result, religious disagreements often provoked civil wars and warfare, subsequently causing new refugee streams. This means that religious refugees in the 16th, 17th or 18th centuries were almost always also political refugees, fleeing a political regime or situation hostile to them. So while religious refugees might seem very few today, in the early modern period, religious refuge became a real mass phenomenon, as it has recently been argued by the Canadian historian Nicholas Terpstra. In a few moments I will tell more about my own research, but first it might be helpful to discuss some of the key points of recent research into early modern religious refugees. First of all, it should be noted here that the number of studies dealing with this topic has seen a remarkable increase over the past decade, even to the extent that one could say that religious refuge is now one of the key themes of early modern religious history. I think the most important evolutions in recent historiography on religious refuge in early modern times can be summarized as follows. First, for a very long time, speaking about religious refugees in this period has been synonymous to speaking about Protestant and particularly Calvinist refugees. In a sense, this is not illogical. Protestants were the first to defy ecclesiastical and worldly authorities, so they probably were the first to be persecuted and forced to leave their homes because of their new religious views. But over the past years, historians have started to look at other religions and confessions too. For instance, to the Jews in 15th century Spain, but also to Catholics in France, the Low Countries, or the German lands. In short, there is no kind of consensus that religious refuge was not something particular to Calvinism, but in fact affected almost every confession during the early modern period. This is a first observation. Second, it has long been assumed that religious refuge almost automatically provoked a kind of religious radicalization. This idea has most vocally been pronounced by the Dutch-American scholar Heiko Obermann, who discerned a reformation of the refugee, as he called it. This expresses the idea that, to a very large extent, religious refuge has shaped not only the Calvinist church organization, but also Calvinist doctrine. But recent research has demonstrated that such processes were not limited to Calvinist refugee communities. Also, among Catholic refugees, a kind of radicalization can be observed, which was often influenced by the relatively young Jesuit order. For this reason, a few years ago, Geert Janssen coined the idea of a counter-reformation of the refugee. But still more recent research, and I'm sure that Mirjam can tell you more about that, has pointed to possibilities for religious refugees, to other possibilities for religious refugees. Radicalization seems not a kind of necessity, but rather an option, and other options, such as developing ideas about religious coexistence, were also possible. A third development is the idea that religious refuge and migration was not only or merely the result of the Protestant Reformation, but rather a result of one of the founding principles of the Reformation, namely the increasing pursuit of religious purity within Christian society. This reading has been defended by the Canadian historian Nicholas Terpstra in his book published a few years ago. He actually starts his analysis with the expulsion of Jews and Muslims in 15th century Spain as a result of the Catholic Reconquista. He argues that the longing for religious purity that can be observed there was a common feature of Christian society in 16th century Europe and provoked similar expulsions, not only of Jews or Muslims, but over time also of fellow Christians. The idea that the strive for religious purity actually caused the mass migrations of early modern times is very tempting, but I think it should be explored further and tested in a larger number of regions to see how important it has really been. These three developments have very much influenced my own research on the ecclesiastical province of Cambrai, a region that might be unknown to you, as it was to myself for a few years ago. But to keep things simple, one could say that this province encompassed the Lublin, or French-speaking regions of the Low Countries, and that its territory more or less corresponds with modern southern Belgium and northern France. Yet, at the origins of the present-day Franco-Belgian border go back only to the second half of the 17th century. This region was once a historic unity governed by the Spanish Habsburg kings. It should also be noted that the province of Cambrai was a frontier zone, a transit zone. It was part of the Habsburg Low Countries, but its inhabitants were French-speaking and, as such, very much attracted to neighboring France. In the west, the region bordered the Channel. In the east, it bordered some of the numerous principalities of the Holy Roman Empire. Of course, this location matters. To a large extent, the fact that it was a border region explains why the Cambrai province became a place of refuge for Catholics from several of the surrounding regions. In total, 3 refugee communities arrived in the region during the later decades of the 16th century. The first refugees that arrived there originated from the British Isles. English Catholics were the first to come, later followed by Irish and Scottish Catholics. They left their homelands during the reign of Elizabeth I and her Protestant successors, and for a very long time hoped to be able to return after Catholic succession had taken place. These proved vain hopes. In the end, they were forced to establish themselves on the continent to organize Catholic education or a Catholic monastic life, to train Catholic priests, or to print Catholic books. So, while the majority of English Catholic faithful continued to live in their home country, an increasing English Catholic institutionalization can be seen on the continent, with colleges, seminaries, and convents founded in Rome, Spain, France, and the Low Countries. Particularly in the Cambrai province, there has been a concentration of such institutions, which would function until the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, and which, to an important extent, guaranteed the survival of Catholic faith in the British Isles. A second group of refugees originated from other parts of the Low Countries. Around 1580, Calvinist regimes had come into power in major cities in the county of Flanders and the Duchy of Brabant, including in Brussels, Bruges, Antwerp, and Ghent. A part of the Catholic clergy or laity was forced to leave these towns or chose to do so voluntarily to avoid confrontation with their Calvinist opponents. Many of them found a temporary refuge in the more southern parts of their country, in towns such as Douai and Saint-Omer, in northern France, where the situation was likewise turbulent, but town governments acted less hostile towards Catholics. Most of these domestic refugees swiftly returned to their home towns after the royal governor Alexander Farnese was able to reconquer several Flemish and Brabant towns in the early 1580s. Along with these exiles, the Council of Flanders, normally established in Ghent, temporarily relocated to Douai, but unlike the British, the refugees did not found any new institutions in their place of refuge. A large group of refugees has been called Diligeurs de l'Exil. They were former members of the French Catholic League, a rather loose grouping of radical Catholics who opposed and battled the accession of Henry of Navarre-Bourbon, a Calvinist, to the French throne. They continued their battle after Henry became king in 1589, and even following his conversion to Catholicism in 1593. In early 1594, Henry was able to reconquer Paris, which had been the last stronghold of the League, and a number of its leaders chose to flee to the territories of the Spanish king Philip II, who continued to support him. Most of these Ligueurs reconciled with the king in the following years, but some of the most compromised among them, who had battled Henry's kingship until the very end of the League and continued to do so from their exile in the Low Countries, would never be able to return. Some of these hardliners remained in the Canberra province until their death, but they never founded their own institutions, and if they would have done so, this would certainly have caused a major diplomatic conflict between the French and Spanish kings. Each of these three groups originated from a different geographical background. The refugees from the British Isles, France, or other parts of the Low Countries came in varying numbers, organized themselves differently, and remained in the Canberra province for longer or shorter periods, depending on developments back home. What I have been investigating more precisely over the past 4 years is the extent to which these different refugee communities made use of local printing presses in the Canberra province in order to achieve their political and religious goals. It has long been established that especially Calvinist refugees successfully and efficiently used the printing press, but it was still very much unclear if Catholic refugees developed similar refugees or not. What I found is that the approach differed between the different groups established in one and the same region, and that this approach was always a response to developments at home as well as possibilities in their places of refuge. To start with, the refugees from other parts of the Low Countries published a very limited number of titles. But from the books they actually published, it appears that they recognized the potential of the printing press not only to fight the viewpoints of their Calvinist adversaries who had taken power in their hometowns, but also to justify their flight or to reinforce the knowledge of Catholic doctrine within their own ranks. As such, they prepared a larger publication program that developed after 1585, and that was part of the process of Catholic revival and reform in the southern parts of the Low Countries. The Diligeurs de l'Exil, for their part, did not cease their fight after they had left their native France. From the Low Countries, they continued what can be considered a propaganda campaign against the new King Henry IV. They continued to publish several pamphlets in which they refuted the legitimacy of Henry's kingship and called the French Catholics not to obey their king. But these subversive publications were all in vain. Henry ultimately occupied the French throne until he was murdered in 1610. Thirdly, the relation of the English Catholics clearly evolved over time. Following their arrival on the continent, they immediately started to publish a considerable number of polemical texts in their own language. But starting from 1570, they preferred to publish in Latin rather than in English. They preferred theological treatises, no longer aimed at English but European audiences. But gradually, they came to understand that the situation in England actually necessitated devotional publications in the vernacular, as a large number of Protestant publications freely circulating there risked to influence the Catholic faithful. Especially from 1600, English Catholics started to issue handbooks of English language editions, of which most were printed in Leuven and Saint-Omer, both located in the Cambrai province. Access to pastoral care and priests remained difficult for Catholics in England, but books offered a solution. Over time, English Catholic elites discovered that books were actually a very good substitute for priestly care, which could only be offered fairly irregularly. In conclusion, the case of the ecclesiastical province of Cambrai demonstrates that not only Calvinists, but also Catholic refugees knew how to use the printing press to their advantage, to enter into theological controversies with their adversaries, to justify their fight, to enhance the knowledge of Catholic doctrine among the faithful, to participate in international theological scholarship, and to influence public opinion in their home countries, or at least try to do so. Yet rather than according to a given model or pattern, the different refugee communities always acted according to their own necessities on a given moment, which in turn were dependent on the specific developments back home. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What justifies my presence here is perhaps not my research on refugees and migrants, because I did come across this subject examining the works of the World Council of Churches, and this is true. And especially I will refer in my analysis to the document "The Other is My Neighbor," developing an ecumenical response to migration, published in Geneva 2015. But what perhaps was the goal of the organizers, it is to come somebody from Central Europe, from the country which has a little bit different approach to present problem of migration than Western countries, and especially our big neighbor Germany. Let us start with what I'm going to say. It will be the setting of sentences. The second point I will try to shorten and skip a little bit to save time, and then we will have a little bit about what happens to the migrants and what may be the most interesting for you, the application of all these theoretical issues to the present situation in Europe and especially in Poland. So migration causes changes in the situation of the country of exile and of the country of destination, and this is true. The main cause of migration, there are many, we will come back to this, but the main causes are poverty and war. It is perhaps obvious for many that the goods of the earth should be shared between all the people, and this is the biggest challenge for today's economy in today's societies. They should serve to all, not only to privileged minority. And what happens when people in many parts of the world are deprived of the necessary resources for life? We should perceive the migrants perhaps as Christians, and the Bible points out that in the Old Testament we can find many references how we should treat the refugees. Well, the word refugee was not used in the Bible, however, the resident alien is the name. So you would treat resident aliens as though they were native born and love them as yourself, for you yourself were once aliens in Egypt. I am Yahweh, your God. And what I want to point out are the words you will treat as they were native born. You must not exploit a poor and needy wage earner, be he one of your brothers or a foreigner resident in your community. Treat others as you would like people to treat you. And from New Testament, what Jesus told us, I was a stranger and you made me welcome. In the same time, he reversed it. I was a stranger and you did not receive me. This point I will skip to save time, but just I wanted to point out that migration always must introduce changes in the cultural, political, and ecclesial landscape of countries of its origin and of its destination, because depriving the country of origin of some category of people, the same category appears in the country of destination, let it be well, a special kind of skilled workers, or let it be members of a given religious community or a given church. And this is also obvious that the needs of migrants will have to be satisfied in the country of destination, so they will look for shelter, job, justice, access to education, medical care, access to worship, and participation rights. And so we are to grant to the migrants all these things we profit from a long time and what we take for granted, and we do not think that it is always mildly granted for them. Migration makes the church become more flexible towards the needs of newcomers. Yes, we have to abandon very often our static well-being and just to move, as Pope Francis pointed out when he was in Krakow last year, that we have to abandon our sofa just to go out and to move, to do something. And the very fact of migration, that the migrants knock our doors, demand from the church and from the churches well, some kind of reaction. It might be also interesting for you to know what is the repartition of migrants according to their religion. And I refer to the research found in the American Pew Research Center. And this study, which is published, is from 2012. There is no very present-day research published yet. But in a global scale, in 2012, nearly half of the migrants were Christians, nearly 1/3 were Muslims, and only 5% Hindus, 3% Buddhists, 2% Jews, 4% of other faiths, and 9% were of no religious affiliation. And now the situation changes if we look at what is the religious affiliation of the migrants who come to Europe. And here the situation is different. Here over 50% of migrants are Muslims, nearly 30% were Christians, but of course this dates from 2010. It is not to be forgotten. And a very low percentage of Hindus, very low percentage of Buddhists, Jews, and people of other religions. When migrants are escaping poverty, they are instantly in the threat of another poverty. People always look for a better place to live. In their native dwelling place, they couldn't provide necessary resources for living. Even relatively good economic status, if unsatisfactory, may cause the search for new possibilities, sometimes far away from home. Economic poverty is a very common but not the only reason of migration. This may also be natural disaster, environmental deterioration, rising sea level or drought, and another factor of migration is war, and very often it is a civil war, or any kind of persecution. In case of war or political, religious or racial persecution, even well-bred people are made to abandon their homes and leave behind all their property. Equipped with what they can carry on their shoulders, such migrants become very quickly caught in the trap of poverty. All these above-mentioned causes of migration have one of many kinds of poverty as their origin. Economic migration may have a positive side in remittance sent home, sent to the country of origin, helping the families left there and contributing to the benefit of economy of a given country. A country receiving migrants also profits from their work by the growth of national product and acquiring the necessary workforce. But there are also shadow sides of migration, and many more than positive sides. The shadow side of the same phenomenon of migration is the change in the social structure of both sending and receiving countries. Separation of families, so-called brain drain of the sending countries when often the most skilled people emigrate for life. To the dark side of the migration is added the eradication from the religious community of origin and very often difficulty in assimilation with the new religious community of destination. The migrants escaping the poverty in the country of origin are very often in threat of becoming a second-class citizens, condemned to a worse condition of work and payment. This happens where the state authorities are not able or not interested to provide the fair law for all. Turning the blind eye on the black market of work is the usual practice of many emerging economic powers and even of well-established economies. Unfair, diminished pay doesn't allow the employee to get their families join them, and thus the separation becomes permanent. The lack of executing the fair law of work or lack of fairness in the application of law to migrants only doesn't allow them to reach the standard equal to the citizens protected by law. The circle is closed and the trap of poverty locked. However, the ability of the Church to deal with poverty has direct implication for her credibility. Having said all this, I will now go to the second part, which is the application of these rules to the present situation, and this I will do the example of Poland. But first of all, we have to ask questions. So let us leave behind for a moment the political correctness, and let us ask these questions which are not perhaps publicly raised in your media here, but which are present in our media and in our political dispute. So first of all, do we have to accept everyone who wants to come and live in our country? Or can we choose whom do we accept or whom do we do not accept? Secondly, is there any limit in number of people to be accepted? Can we set a quota? We can receive 1,000 of people, 100,000, 1 million, or let it be a limited number. Can we make any difference between migrants and refugees? Or can we say we will take refugees because they are really in need, and the economic migrants, well, they have to look for a chance elsewhere. Next, what about the argument of safety? So, especially in the direct threat of the terrorist attack. Here in the Western countries, people very often live in the constant threat, and comparing the streets full of armed policemen, of soldiers with machine guns, and comparing the very quiet streets in other countries, like in Poland, where never ever happened any terrorist attack because there were no terrorists admitted into the country. Next, shall we not rather help the migrants, refugees, in the countries of their origin? So to bring help to those countries where people are in need, and not to wait when these people will come here to satisfy their needs. Why do we help the richer who could pay the smuggler's fees and leave behind the poor who could not escape? It is well, common knowledge that to pay the smuggler's fee from Africa to Europe, it's roughly $15,000 large sum of money. And well, from Syria or Iraq, it is about 8 or 10,000 euros. So it's a large sum of money, and we receive the people who could pay all these fees, and the poor had to stay because they had absolutely no money to pay such a voyage. What is our responsibility for pushing the waves of migrants out of their homeland by feeding the local wars with the arms gladly provided by so-called democratic countries, also European ones? Is it not a hypocrisy that the same European countries which are to receive the waves of migrants, they have provoked these waves of migrants by feeding the war? They send arms, they make a lot of money on the arm selling, and then they say, well, there is a war in this country, we have to receive these people. How deeply the fear of Islamization determined the views of Christian-based countries in Europe? It is very politically incorrect question, but nevertheless we have to put this question. Are we entitled to protect the Christian identity of our societies, or did we decide that our society is not anymore Christian, so there is nothing to defend? And obviously I will not answer all these questions because, well, I'm short of time. But I hope that you will pose this question and then we will be able to answer it a bit more. Just to add some little words to this, what I have already said. Well, something what is absolutely absent perhaps in your media. You don't know, because you cannot know, your media never inform you about this, that Poland has received a large wave of migration from Ukraine. Because of the war in Donetsk, we have received thousands of refugees of war from the eastern Ukraine. But previously, we have received nearly 100,000 of refugees of war from Chechnya, where, because of Russian aggression in 2 consecutive wars in Chechnya, the country was absolutely destroyed, and so many thousands of Chechens found shelter and asylum in Poland. And what about the economic migrants? We have received over 1 million of Ukrainian workers. These people came to our country, settled down, found work, assimilated, and they become gradually taxpayers in Poland, and they link their future with this country. So this is the general outline of the situation, political situation, but 2 more words about what the Catholic Church is trying to do for the refugees. Well, the aim of the Catholic Church in Poland is to help wisely. That means to go with the help to the poor, to the countries where they are refugees. So if there are refugees in Iraq, internal refugees, or in Syria, in already liberated Aleppo, or the hundreds of thousands of Syrian immigrants in Lebanon, Polish church-based organizations as Caritas and the Polish branch of the church in need are in the forefront of the health programs for the Syrian refugees and victims of war. initially using only the money of believers, and then very strongly subsidized by present Polish government, these organizations provide shelter, medical care and food. The goal is to help these people to survive and rebuild their lives in the country of origin. e.g. already liberated parts of Syria and in the neighboring countries like Lebanon. The decision made by this organization was to help the poor who did not have money to pay the smugglers and had to stay in the Middle East. Making all the inhabitants of these territories come to Europe means also to depopulate their countries. And this was pointed out very repeatedly, that if ISIS wants to cast out Christians out of Middle East, would we help them, making them come to Europe? No. The Christian presence in these countries were from not decades, but from thousands of years, 2,000 years of Christian presence. So, are we going to help in depopulation of these countries, or would we help these people to go back to their homes and to rebuild it? And this is what these Polish charity church organizations are doing. Another initiative was undertaken by a private foundation called Esther, led by a Polish lady of Syrian origin. The foundation may come to Poland whole families from Syria and found for them home and work. But the success was partial, as many of these people used Poland as a stage on the way to Western Europe. It is because, as the study shows, well, the refugees and the migrants don't want to settle in Poland and seek rich countries like Sweden, Germany, Great Britain, perhaps also France, when the social benefits are high. And if we receive, it is the argument of our government, if we receive even this quota of migrants assigned by European Union, what would we do with them if they don't want to go to Poland? We would have to build prisons, perhaps, to incarcerate them and keep them against their will if they don't want to go to poorer country, but to rich country to use the social system. The Polish Episcopal Conference, and this is the last word already, quarrels with the government to establish so-called humanitarian corridors. So the church wants to pay for receiving the casualties of war for treatment in Polish hospitals. But as for now, the government doesn't agree. I'm pretty aware that I could only touch the very vast problem of receiving the migrants to Europe and to my country, and I also believe that I could tell you something about the phenomena totally absent in your media in Western Europe, suffering from political correctness and falsely accusing other countries of not being supportive to the migrants. I know that I did not answer many of the questions, but it is impossible in 15 minutes. You will have the discussion to ask more questions, and we will try to find responses. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, friends. A sincere word of appreciation to the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this very stimulating discourse last 3 days, and to speak on this panel. Though I'm a Lutheran by confession, since I'm the only speaker from the Global South, and to be very specific, from the wider world, a context other than Europe and North America, I would like to reflect on the topic of this panel from the perspective of my engagement with some movements and initiatives that address the realities of massive displacement of people on account of war and violence, forced migration, and systemic marginalization and exclusion of millions of people in many parts of the world, more specifically in Asia and India, which is the country of my origin. So the one from the wider world has the last word. Let me also mention that the majority of Christians now live in the global south, and their numbers are growing. They are known by many ecclesiastical identities and in many ecclesial formations, and exist mostly as minority communities in predominantly multi-religious contexts, now increasingly feeling threatened and marginalized on account of the rise of right-wing religious resurgence, especially in Southern Asia, in India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and many other parts of the world. These Christian communities are predominantly from the socially and economically disempowered sections and are marginalized and have little or no public space at all. Poverty, multiple forms of injustice, social exclusions, environmental disasters, political repression, corruption, use and misuse of power are the realities that overwhelm and surround these ecclesial communities, whether they are Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, or charismatic. Therefore, my reflections are informed primarily by the challenges arising out of these contexts of rapidly changing political and social as well as ecclesial landscapes within which Christian faith is practiced and affirmed. So let's first talk about the refugees and migrants. According to the recent UNHCR statistics, there are over 65.6 million refugees, asylum seekers, stateless people, and displaced people around the world today as a result of international policies, military and economic interests of the wealthy and powerful countries, and of course man-made and natural disasters. On average, 20 people were driven from homes every minute last year, or every 3 seconds, less than the time it takes me to say this sentence. Furthermore, in addition to what we know about the 34 million people in UN refugee camps in Lebanon, Kenya, Turkey, and Jordan, and many other places, we have also recently been hearing about the plight of the Rohingyas as stateless people, exposed to harshest forms of violence as part of ethnic cleansing that is taking place in Myanmar. To this, we must also add those living under occupation in Palestine, West Papua, and elsewhere. So is the case with millions of people who are forced to migrate. Migrants are not just one broad category. There are privileged migrant workers like me and some of us here, but there are many others who are forced to migrate on account of a variety of factors. You know, on the pavements and under the flyovers of India's capital, Delhi, and Bombay, and Calcutta, and many of these big cities, you will find hundreds of people from the drought-hit regions of central India. It is reported that at least 20 children belonging to these families disappear every day. So is the case in many Indian cities. Across the borders of India and Bangladesh, thousands flee into India to escape poverty caused by the negative impact of globalized agro-industry and rising sea levels. In the Indo-China region, that is Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, and this region is a flourishing market for child and sex traffickers. According to the just released UN statistics, over 40 million people from about 161 countries are trafficked in 2016, out of whom 90% are women and children in the age group of 18 to 24. Most of these are trafficked for begging, organs, and forced labor and hazardous and sex. In the remote regions of northern Sri Lanka, there are about 80,000 young war widows in similar predicament. The list can be very, very long in each country. But these are just statistics, but these also reveal three ugly truths about our generation. One is the extent of moral degeneration of the world that we belong and its economic and political options of relying on the abuse of the human being and the earth to satiate its greed for power, wealth, and pleasure. Two is the hidden faces and names of these victims. These are mostly people from certain geopolitical locations, social, ethnic, and religious identities, made and kept poor and vulnerable, terrorized and shackled in order to be exploited. So therefore, powers are able to parade and perpetuate themselves by disempowering many, and these power orientations are the operating principles of many of our social dynamics and social structures. And the third and the most crucial challenge is the new remix of religion and politics, manifesting itself through aggressive and exclusionary right-wing political and economic ideologies, and the consequent distortion of religious resources to exploit and express certain sections of the society, as already mentioned. Religious resources are once again at play, claiming monopoly over religious beliefs, doctrines, manipulating common sense of the communities to consolidate power, sustain political and social hierarchies, and continue economic and exploitation. We must remember that similar geopolitical dynamics provided the backdrop for a Protestant Reformation too. The challenge for us, therefore, is to explore ways in which religious vocation is pursued as a life-sustaining resource rather than as an ally of the networks of evil and injustice. If the church is always in need of reformation, what are the areas for reform and renewal of our theological vocation so that the church stays not only relevant but as a conscience keeper, a moral force, and as a sign of the coming reign of God? Perhaps moving away from the contours of the doctrines of the church to the public square, to the world which is rapidly changing and increasingly becoming complex. Perhaps a move away from concepts and formulations to contexts of suffering and struggle. Or perhaps getting into creative conversation and engagement with the signs of hope, the struggles of the marginalized and the displaced, where God is at work. I would like to lift up 4 moral challenges, there could be many more, arising out of the experiences of the forced migrants, refugees, and internally displaced people, and other discriminated and excluded communities for our theological consideration. First is the dominant trend of othering the other. Most world religions, including Christianity, while furthering their self-perpetuating missions, have played a major role in this process of othering. Operating alongside nationalism, ethnicity, racism, patriarchy, and in my context, casteism, religions have always encouraged people to nurture inflated self-understandings and detrimental understandings of those who do not belong to their fold. Colonialism and neo-colonialism, slavery and modern forms of slavery, violence against women, child labor, racism, casteism, ableism, violence against religious minorities, indigenous peoples, environmental exploitation, and consequent destruction all have their roots in these dynamics of othering. I am better than the other, and I deserve more. Fear and hatred on the one hand, and rejection and objectification on the other, are strongly nurtured by aggressive assertion of certain religious beliefs and orientation. The other, the outsider, is seen as a wily predator or as an enemy. Ironically, the powerful majority imagine themselves as victims by exaggerating the capacities of people in need, and thus mischievously ascribe to them a non-existent power. How do we do theology that affirms the very nature of God as a source of all, and God's grace that is unconditional, and as one that ensures life for all? That takes me to my second challenge of diversity. In a world that seems to be increasingly opting for narrow and exclusionary formations of human togetherness, the celebration of diversity and affirmation of inclusivity become theological tasks, not only as a way of healing divisions, but also to bear witness to the God of creation. Creation in all its beauty and grandeur is diverse and interdependent, and as such is a divine self-expression. What is necessary for us Christians is to endeavor to see how we can be one in sustaining this diversity through our vocation of seeking justice, which I believe is the precondition for the sustenance of life. But to put it differently, we are called to be one to seek justice and to do good, so that God's creation may continue to flourish in all diversity. Without such anchoring in its purpose, emphasis on unity alone smacks of Western disdain for diversity and tends to hold diversity as a problem. If Christian unity does not affirm God's creative wisdom in the diversity of God's creation, if it does not affirm the image of God and the identity and dignity of every human person, and if it chooses to remain silent and indifferent amidst realities of injustice, aggression and disempowerment of the weak and the vulnerable, what the world may believe is that the God does not stand for justice and that God is neutral. And the third challenge is the use, misuse and abuse of power. Most of our structures of relationships, both at larger and personal levels, are guided by certain concepts of power anchored in their capacity to exercise one's will over others, subjugate, manipulate, and dominate in order to validate themselves as superior to others. Consequently, oppressive hierarchies and various combinations of power dominate our lives today, and the greed for power is ravaging the lives of millions and destroying the creation. In a context such as this, how do we affirm God as omnipotent when the powers of empire are enslaving and dehumanizing many in the name of the same omnipotent God? The images of the powerful and triumphant God used by the forces of domination and control will not help in our struggle against the powers of empire. We need to explore and assert positive concepts of power that present it as a creative energy and life-sustaining ethic rather than as a status or privilege. The last and the fourth point or challenge that I would like to present is our contemporary definitions and positions on justice, which tend to be too broad and neutral. Let me also emphasize that there seems to be a rapid changes in people's attitudes towards values of justice, equity, and dignity. And in that, injustice and privilege are increasingly seen as normal, and indignation against such is subdued by warped theories of nationalism, religious homogeneity, and cultural pride. If this injustice is created and sustained by collectives of political, economic, military, social, and religious powers, and if wars and violence are waged to strengthen the economies of certain countries, what resources and strategies do churches have to counter? What moral authenticity and voice do we have? Justice, as it is commonly held, is not merely a value pursued in the dynamics of larger social relationships. God's justice in Christ is neither forensic nor neutral, but biased towards the oppressed. Being just and seeking justice arises out of one's capacity to love the other as oneself. The neighbor, Jesus points out in the parable, is not the familiar next door neighbor, but the other, the human being, even if his or her face is not seen and name not known. The neighbor is also the other, the victim by the roadside. This love is a conscious spiritual choice that expresses itself in action when injustice tramples over life. God's love, therefore, is an expression of God's justice. This implies that an attitude of compassion towards the marginalized and excluded people without recognizing their yearning for justice is not the kind of love that God desires. It suggests a deeper meaning of Christian love, in that love as a critique of injustice, or to put it differently, justice as a concrete expression of love. Let me conclude by saying that perhaps these moral challenges, that this reality of the massive displacement of people at this moment in time, as we commemorate the Reformation, prompt us to reimagine church as a movement, accompanying these people, these millions of people in their pilgrimage, in their yearning for life, for justice and peace and dignity, rather than a homogeneous, a mere community of fellowship of believers. Church is to be seen not in its structures and traditions, but in locales where God's Spirit is present in actions for justice and life. Thank you very much.